I need a husband, not a hired hand, Ruth Calloway said, and Daniel Foss nearly dropped the hat he'd just taken off in greeting. The wind carried the smell of cut hay and horse sweat across the yard, and somewhere behind the barn a rooster complained about the hour. Daniel stood there with his hat in both hands, sun-scorched and dust-caked from 3 days of walking, and waited for the woman to laugh, to say she was joking, to do anything but stare at him with that flat, unblinking calm. She didn't laugh. You heard me right, she said. Ranches near 2,000 acres. Bank wants the note paid by first snow or they take it. I can't run it alone, and I can't pay a hand enough to make him stay through winter. But a husband's got reason to stay. She looked him over the way a rancher looks over a horse at auction. Not unkindly, just thorough. You've got a strong back and empty pockets. I've got land and no ring. Seems like plain arithmetic to me. Daniel had walked from Abilene with nothing but a bedroll, a Colt he hadn't fired in 2 years, and a debt of guilt heavier than either. He'd come looking for work. Mucking stalls, mending fence, anything that would let him sleep without dreaming. He had not come looking for a wife. Ma'am, he said carefully, I only asked if you needed a hand. I do need a hand. I need 2 of them, attached to a man who won't run off come the first hard frost like the last 3 did. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. There was iron laid under it, the kind that came from years of holding a place together with will alone. You're free to walk on. Road goes both ways. But if you're looking for a bed and a meal and a reason to stop wandering, I'm offering one. Plain as that. He should have walked. Later, he would wonder why he didn't. Why his boots stayed rooted in the dust of that yard instead of carrying him back toward the horizon he'd come from. Maybe it was the exhaustion in his legs. Maybe it was the way she'd said reason to stop wandering. Like she'd looked straight through his ribs and read the thing written there in old, unhealed ink. Or maybe it was her eyes. Ruth Calloway's eyes were the pale gray of a sky before a storm, and they didn't waver when they looked at him, didn't flinch the way most folks did when they caught the scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw. She looked at the scar and then at him like the two were separate things worth separate consideration. Why me? He asked. You don't know me from any drifter on this road. I know you stopped when you saw my fence down 2 miles back and fixed it before you ever reached my door. Watched you do it from the ridge with my rifle scope if you want the truth of it. A corner of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Man who mends a stranger's fence without being asked has got more character than most men who'd promise it to my face. Somewhere in the barn, a horse kicked at its stall, a hollow, restless sound. Daniel's hand found the brim of his hat again, turning it slow between his fingers, an old habit from days he tried not to remember. 3 days ago, he'd been another man's problem. 3 days before that, he'd been the reason a man was dead. A fact he carried the way some men carried a limp, visible in nothing but the way he moved through the world, careful, apologetic, waiting for the debt to come due. I've got nothing to offer a wife, he said. No name worth having. No money. Nothing but a strong back, like you said. Strong back's what I asked for. Ruth crossed her arms, and for the first time something flickered behind the gray of her eyes. Not softness, not yet, but the shadow of it, waiting. I'm not asking for love, Mr. Foss. I'm asking for a partner. There's a difference, and I expect you know it better than most, coming up that road the way you did, alone and looking like a man running from something instead of toward it. The accusation landed soft but true, and Daniel felt it settle in his chest like a stone dropped in still water. He thought of the grave he'd left behind in Kansas, unmarked because he hadn't had the courage to carve a name into what he couldn't bear to read. He thought of the promise he'd made and broken, and the one he hadn't made yet and already feared breaking. I don't know your name, he said instead of answering. Ruth Calloway. This was my father's land before the fever took him last spring. My brother rode off with the money meant to pay the note, and he isn't coming back to help me hold what's left of it. She said it without a tremor, but Daniel caught the way her jaw set on the last words, the way her hand found the doorframe beside her and gripped it, just once, before letting go. I've got until the first snow. That's not long, so I'm not going to waste it pretending I've got the luxury of courting. The wind shifted, carrying dust across the yard, and somewhere far off a coyote called once and went silent. Daniel looked past her at the house, modest, well-built, the kind of place a man could have been proud to raise a family in, if the world had been kinder to the people inside it. He looked at the barn, at the fence he'd already half repaired without being asked, at the woman standing in the doorway with a proposition that should have been madness and somehow wasn't. "If I say yes," he said slowly, "you understand you're marrying a stranger. Everybody's a stranger before they're not." Ruth's gaze didn't waver. "Question is whether you're a stranger worth the risk. I've made my guess. Now it's your turn to make yours." Daniel Foss stood in the dust of a yard that wasn't his, holding a hat that had seen better years, and felt the shape of a decision closing around him like a hand around a throat. Not choking, not yet, but present, undeniable, demanding an answer before the sun dropped any lower in the sky. He didn't answer right away. Ruth didn't push him to. She only turned, walked back into the shade of the porch, and set a coffee pot on the stove like the matter could wait as long as it needed to, though the tightness in her shoulders said otherwise. Daniel stood in the yard another long minute, turning the offer over the way he'd turn a coin, looking for the trick in it, the con, the reason a woman would offer marriage to a man she'd known for the length of one conversation. He found none. That unsettled him more than if he had. He thought of Kansas. He thought of Elias Bowen, the man he'd ridden with for 2 years, the man who'd trusted him with a secret and a debt, both of which Daniel had failed to protect. He thought of the promise he'd made at Elias's grave, that he'd stop drifting, stop taking the easy road out of every hard place, stop being a man who ran when running was simplest. He walked to the porch. "I'll work the land," he said. "Fair trade for room and board, same as any hand. But I won't make you a promise I can't keep just because it's convenient for us both." Ruth studied him over the rim of a tin cup, steam curling between them. "That's not a no. It's not a yes either." "Fair enough." She set the cup down. "You'll sleep in the barn loft till we've settled the matter proper. I don't take strangers into my house on faith alone, husband or hand." There was a dry humor under the words, the first hint he'd seen that she wasn't made entirely of iron. "But I'll tell you this, the note's due in 11 weeks. I need hands in the field before then, not a man deliberating in my yard." He nodded and went to work that same afternoon, because work was a language he understood better than promises. He mended what fence remained, cleared brush from the north pasture, and when evening came he ate at her table, across from her, not beside, while she watched him with those pale, assessing eyes and said little. It was 3 days later that Silas Meade rode into the yard. Daniel was up on the barn roof, replacing shingles gone soft with rot, when he heard the horse and looked down to see a man dismounting with the easy confidence of someone who believed the land beneath him already belonged to his future. Meade was clean-shaven, well-dressed for ranch country, and he looked at Ruth the way a man looks at something he intends to acquire. "Miss Calloway." He tipped his hat. "Heard you took on a new hand." His eyes drifted up to Daniel on the roof, assessing, dismissive. "Didn't hear you took on a husband prospect." "Word travels fast for a town 4 miles off," Ruth said, and there was no warmth in it. "Word travels fast when a man's got interest in a matter." Meade's smile didn't reach his eyes. "The bank holds your note, Miss Calloway. I hold no small amount of influence with the bank. Seemed only neighborly to remind you that there are friendlier ways to settle a debt than marrying the first drifter who wanders up your road." Daniel came down from the roof slow, deliberate, boots finding each rung of the ladder with a calm he didn't entirely feel. He'd seen men like Meade before, men who mistook a woman's hardship for an opening, who wore charm like a weapon and used debt the way other men used a gun. "Ma'am's already got a hand," Daniel said, planting himself at the base of the ladder. "Reckon that answers whatever question brought you out here." Meade's gaze slid to him, cataloging the scar, the dust, the worn holster at his hip. "And you are?" "Daniel Foss." "Foss." Meade turned the name over like he was testing it for rot. "Can't say I know the name. Can't say that recommends you, either." He looked back to Ruth. "The offer stands, Miss Calloway. The bank might find reason to extend your note if the right arrangement were made. Might even find reason to forget it. But that offer's got a season on it same as everything else, and it won't last past first frost." "I'll take my chances with the note," Ruth said. "Good day, Mr. Meade." He held her gaze a moment longer than courtesy required, then mounted his horse and rode off in a slow cloud of dust, unhurried, a man accustomed to getting what he wanted eventually. Ruth exhaled once he was gone, and for the first time Daniel saw the crack in her composure, the way her hand trembled faintly at her side before she stilled it by force of will alone. "He'll be back," Daniel said. "He always is." She turned toward the house, then stopped, looking back at him with something new in her expression. Not quite trust, but the beginning of it. A door left open a crack instead of bolted shut. "That's the second reason I need a husband, Mr. Foss. Not just the note. Meade's wanted this land since before my father died. And a woman alone is a door he thinks he can walk through. A woman married." She let the sentence hang, unfinished, and didn't need to finish it. Daniel thought of Elias again, of the vow made over unmarked earth, of every road he'd walked since that led nowhere but away from consequence. He thought of how easy it would be to keep walking now, to leave before the debt of this place became his debt too. "I'll stay through the note," he said. "That much I can promise plain. Whatever comes after, we'll see when we get there." Something in Ruth's shoulders loosened, just slightly. Not relief exactly, but the absence of one more weight pressing down. "That's more honesty than I expected from a man in your position." "Only kind I've got left to give," he said, and meant it more than she could know. That night, lying in the barn loft with the smell of hay and horse and old leather around him, Daniel listened to the wind moving through the boards and thought about Meade's eyes, about the particular hunger in them, and understood with sudden clarity that 11 weeks was not a deadline. It was a fuse. The fire came on the 9th night. Daniel woke to the smell of smoke thick enough to taste, and by the time he'd swung down from the loft the north pasture fence was a line of flame crawling toward the hayfield, driven by a wind that seemed almost deliberate in its cruelty. He hit the ground running, shouting for Ruth, and found her already at the well, hauling water with a strength that belied the fear tightening her face. "Grass fire," she gasped, "started at the fence line." "That's no accident, Daniel. Nothing starts a fire clean at a fence line without help." He didn't need convincing. He'd seen the shape of the flame's edge, too straight, too deliberate, a line drawn by a hand rather than chance. They fought it together through the black hours before dawn, beating flame with wet sacking, digging fire breaks with hands blistered raw, choking on smoke that stung the eyes and scoured the throat. By the time the fire guttered out against the break they dug, half the north pasture was ash and both of them were coated in soot and exhaustion, standing in the gray light of near morning like survivors of something larger than a fire. "Meade," Ruth said, staring at the blackened field. "Can't prove it. Don't need to prove it. Need to survive it." She wiped a forearm across her face, smearing ash deeper into the lines of exhaustion there. 11 weeks is now 9, and we've lost feed we can't replace before winter." Daniel said nothing, but something had shifted in him overnight. Watching her fight a fire she hadn't started with the same grim determination she'd offered him marriage. Not from weakness, but from a refusal to be moved. He'd known men who broke under less. She only burned hotter, colder, steadier. They rebuilt through the following days in silence more often than words. Two people learning each other's rhythms through labor rather than conversation. Daniel found himself watching her, the economy of her movements, the way she never wasted emotion, the calluses on hands that a woman raised for finer things shouldn't have had, and did. It was on the 6th day after the fire that Meade returned, this time with 2 riders flanking him, and a paper in his hand that he held up like a flag of victory. Banks groaned concerned. He called from the yard, not bothering to dismount. "Fire damage, they tell me, reduces the value securing your note. Might accelerate the timeline. Might call it due within the month unless—" His eyes found Ruth's. "Unless certain accommodations are made." "Get off my land," Ruth said. "It's the bank's land, Miss Calloway, in every way that matters until that note's paid." Meade's smile was thin as a blade's edge. "I'd hate to see you lose it out of pride when a simple conversation might save it." Daniel stepped forward, and one of the flanking rider's hands drifted toward a holster, a small motion. But Daniel had spent enough years reading the language of violence to know a threat when he saw one gathering. The lady said, "Get off her land." Daniel said, voice level, hand loose and ready at his own side. I take that as more than a suggestion. Meade's eyes moved over him with fresh calculation, weighing the scar, the stillness, the readiness in a man who didn't posture because he didn't need to. Something in his expression flickered. Not quite fear, but reconsideration. You're either very brave or very foolish, Mr. Foss, Meade said. Out here, that's often the same thing. Then I reckon we'll find out which, Daniel said, the day you push it. For a long moment, nobody moved. The wind stirred the ash-black grass at the pasture's edge, and somewhere a hawk cried once overhead, indifferent to the men below. Then Meade laughed, short, humorless, and gathered his reins. Month's grace, Miss Calloway. That's what I can offer, and it's more than you'll get elsewhere. He looked at Daniel one last time. Enjoy your hired protection while it lasts. Hired men have a way of moving on when the money runs short, and I happen to know exactly how thin her purse has grown. They rode off, and Ruth let out a breath she'd been holding since the riders first appeared. He'll act on it, she said quietly. The fire was a warning. Whatever comes next won't be. Then we don't wait for next, Daniel said. We go to the bank ourselves. Show them the ledgers, the herd count. Prove the land's worth more standing than Meade's claiming it's worth burned. And if that's not enough? Daniel looked at her, at the soot still smudged along her jaw, at the fear she refused to let settle into her voice even now. Then we find what is enough. I didn't come this far to watch a man like Meade take what isn't his because a woman had the courage to stand alone and nobody stood with her. Ruth studied him a long moment, something unreadable moving behind her storm-gray eyes. You said you wouldn't promise what you couldn't keep. I'm not promising, Daniel said. I'm choosing. There's a difference, same as you told me the day I walked up this road. That night, for the first time, she didn't send him to the barn loft alone. She sat with him on the porch steps instead, both of them too tired for words, watching the stars whirl slow overhead while the scorched pasture breathed its bitter smell into the dark. A fragile piece, bought with fire, and Daniel understood it wouldn't hold much longer. It was 2 nights later that Ruth showed him the bracelet. She'd been quiet through supper, quieter than usual, and after the plates were cleared she reached into a small wooden box on the mantel and drew out a thin band of braided leather and silver wire, worn smooth from handling. My mother's, she said, turning it in the lamplight. She made it herself out here the year she and my father first broke this ground. Said a ranch built on love instead of convenience was worth the hardship of building it. Faint, humorless smile. She died before I understood what she meant by that. Daniel took the bracelet when she offered it, feeling the worn grooves where fingers other than his own had traced it 1,000 times before. What happened to her? Same fever that took my father years apart. Different seasons, same land, same stubbornness that kept them here when easier folks would have sold and gone east. Ruth sat across from him at the table, hands folded, gaze somewhere past him, in a memory he couldn't share. I used to think that stubbornness was foolish. Now I understand it's the only thing that ever built anything worth having out here. Daniel turned the bracelet over once more before handing it back. I had someone once, he said, the words coming slower than he expected, dragged up from a place he'd kept sealed for 2 years. Man named Elias Bowen. Rode with him near 2 years, through worse country than this. He trusted me with something. A debt he owed dangerous men chasing it. I told him I'd handle it. I didn't. Handled it wrong, and it cost him his life instead of mine, which was the trade that should have been made. Ruth didn't offer easy comfort, didn't rush to tell him it wasn't his fault, the way some might have. She only listened, steady, the way she seemed to meet everything, head-on without flinching. Is that why you were walking that road alone? She asked. Running from what happened. Running from the man I was when it happened, Daniel said. Thought if I kept moving, I could outpace what I'd become. Turns out a man carries himself wherever he walks. Should have learned that sooner. Scars mean it lived, Ruth said quietly, and touched the one along his jaw for the first time, her fingers light, questioning rather than certain. That's what my mother used to say about the land, about people. Something that's been hurt and healed's got more truth in it than something that was never touched at all. Daniel didn't move away from her touch, though every instinct built over 2 years of penance told him he should. that he didn't deserve the gentleness of it. I got this the same night Elias died, he said. Same men. I lived. He didn't. Some days I can't work out why the world made that particular trade. Maybe it wasn't a trade, Ruth said. Maybe it was a debt. And maybe you've been trying to pay it back to the wrong people ever since. Strangers, drifting work, anyone but yourself. She withdrew her hand, but something had shifted between them. A door opened that wouldn't easily close again. I'm not asking you to forget him, Daniel. I'm asking you to stop punishing yourself in his name. That's not honoring a debt. That's just another kind of running. He sat with that a long while, the lamp guttering low between them, casting her face half in gold light and half in shadow. Outside, the wind moved through the scorched pasture with a low, mournful sound, and somewhere a coyote called and was answered. Mead's not wrong about one thing, Daniel said finally. Hired men do move on. I've done it my whole life. Every town, every job, every promise I ever half made. But I don't want to be that man here. Not with you. Not with this. He gestured, not just at the house, but at something larger, the fragile, dangerous, unlikely thing growing between them in the space of 9 days. Ruth's composure cracked, just slightly, just enough to show the fear beneath it. Not of Mead, not of the bank, but of hope itself, of wanting something and losing it the way she'd lost everyone else who'd ever mattered to this land. Don't say it if you don't mean it. I've buried enough people who left before they meant to stay. I mean it, Daniel said. 11 weeks ago I'd have told you I had nothing left worth offering anyone. I still don't have much. But I've got a debt I mean to pay properly this time, to Elias, by finally becoming the man I told him I'd be. And I've got a choice in front of me that doesn't feel like running. For the first time in 2 years. She looked at him a long moment, storm-gray eyes searching his face for the lie she half expected and didn't find. Then, slowly, she took the bracelet from where it lay between them and pressed it into his palm, closing his fingers around it. Keep it, she said, till we know whether this is worth the risk we've both taken. Outside, far off but unmistakable, a rifle shot cracked across the darkness. A single report, deliberate, a warning rather than an attack, and both of them rose from the table at once, the fragile peace of the evening shattering into the sharper, colder reality of what still waited beyond the porch light. They found Mead's men at the fence line come morning, not attacking, but waiting, 3 riders positioned along the property's edge like men settling in for a siege rather than a single strike. Daniel understood the strategy at once. Not fire this time, not open violence, but pressure, slow and grinding, meant to starve them into surrender before the note ever came due. He means to bleed us dry a day at a time, Ruth said, watching from the ridge. Can't work the herd with armed men squatting on the boundary. Can't sell cattle we can't move to market. Then we don't wait for the note, Daniel said. We go to town. Today. Show the bank what Mead's doing, armed men on private land, a fire that started too clean to be accident. Let them see exactly what kind of man they're doing business with. It took the better part of the day to reach town, riding hard, the two of them arriving dust-caked and grim at the bank's door just before closing. The manager, a cautious man named Whitfield, listened to their account with growing unease, his eyes flicking twice toward the window as though expecting Mead himself to walk through it. Mead holds paper on half the ranches in this county, Whitfield admitted quietly, once Daniel had laid out the timeline. The fire, the riders, the pattern of pressure applied to widows and strugglers alike. If what you're saying is true, he's been engineering failures to acquire land cheap, then reselling at profit to the railroad survey coming through next spring. Can you prove it? Ruth asked. I can look, Whitfield said. I should have looked sooner. It took 3 more days, tense, watchful days, with Mead's riders still camped at the fence line like vultures waiting out a dying animal, before Whitfield rode out to the ranch himself, accompanied by a county marshal and a ledger thick with evidence. Falsified fire reports, inflated notes, a pattern of predatory foreclosure stretching back 3 years across a dozen properties. Mead was waiting in the yard when they arrived, as though some instinct had warned him the reckoning had finally come. He watched the marshal dismount with the calm of a man still convinced his charm could talk him clear of any trouble, right up until the moment the marshal read the warrant aloud and the calm finally, visibly cracked. This is a misunderstanding, Mead said, backing toward his horse. A woman's word against a ledger with your bank clerk's signature on falsified assessments, Whitfield said flatly. Against 3 other ranchers willing to testify to fires that started too clean at their fence lines too. This isn't a misunderstanding, Silas. It's the end of a very long con. Daniel watched Meade's face as the truth of his own undoing settled over him. The particular, satisfying collapse of a man who'd built his power on other people's fear, finally meeting consequence he couldn't charm or threaten his way past. It wasn't triumph Daniel felt watching it. It was something quieter. Relief, maybe, or the closing of a door that had been left dangerously open too long. The marshal took Meade away in irons before sundown, his riders scattering at the fence line without their paymaster to hold them there. The note, Whitfield promised before he left, would be reassessed fairly. The fire damage weighed against the truth of what had caused it rather than what Meade had claimed. That evening, Ruth and Daniel stood together at the edge of the scorched north pasture, watching the sun bleed orange and gold across a sky finally free of smoke or threat. New grass had already begun pushing up green through the ash, stubborn and small. The way things on this land always seemed to insist on surviving. Guess the note's not the fuse it was, Ruth said. Guess I don't need a husband quite so urgent as I did 11 days ago. Daniel turned the bracelet over in his fingers. He'd kept it, as she'd asked, through every hour since. Suppose that means I'm free to walk on, if walking's still what I want. Is it? He looked at her, soot-streaked, exhausted, unbroken in every way that mattered. The woman who'd offered a stranger a bargain built on plain arithmetic and gotten, somewhere in the process, something neither of them had bargained for. He thought of Elias, of the promise made over unmarked earth, and understood at last that he'd finally kept it. Not by punishing himself into oblivion, but by choosing, deliberately, to stay and build rather than drift and run. No, Daniel said, it's not what I want. Haven't wanted it since the day you told me you needed a husband instead of a hand. Took me a while to admit it, is all. Ruth held out her palm, and Daniel placed the bracelet into it. Not as a return, but as an offering, the choice complete and freely made. She closed her fingers around it, around him, around the fragile, hard-won thing they'd built out of fire and honesty in the space of 11 uncertain weeks. Then let's build something worth the stubbornness it'll take to keep it, she said. They were married the following spring, in the same yard where he'd first stood with his hat in his hands. The north pasture green and whole again behind them. No longer a scar on the land, but simply another season's growth. Years later, when their daughter asked why there were 2 names carved into the old porch beam instead of just the date of the wedding, Ruth would tell her it wasn't a wedding date at all. It was the day a drifter asked for work, and a woman offered him a home instead, and both of them, against every hard lesson life had taught them, chose to believe it could last. The carving is still there today, weathered but legible. Ruth Daniel built it stubborn, kept it true.